Good afternoon, or whatever time it is where you are. I'm Mark Evanier, and this is the annual Jack Kirby Tribute Panel. Since Jack passed away in February of 1994, I have demanded of every comic convention I've attended that I get to do a Jack Kirby Tribute Panel. This is because, first of all, I was fortunate enough to know Jack and work with him, and I feel an obligation to share some of what I observe with the world. And secondly, it's because when I go to a convention, everybody asks me questions about Jack, and I answer some of the same questions over and over, and it's easier and a lot of fun to get everybody who loves Jack's work together in a big room at some point in the convention and discuss him. So we do that every year at San Diego. We can't do it at San Diego this year, so we're doing it online. So welcome. If you're interested in Jack Kirby, this is the place you should be. I am joined this year by John Morrow, who is the publisher, editor, person behind the Jack Kirby Collector. He started out as a little newsletter about his favorite artist, and now, how many issues is it, John?
Working on finalizing issue 79 right now.
And there is no one else in the comic book history of comics that you could do 79 issues about without even scratching the surface of all that there is to say about the guy. It's an amazing testimony to how fascinating we are about Jack, how fascinated we all are about Jack, and how much creativity there was there to write about. We are also joined by Mr. Alex Ross. Now, there's nothing that Jack liked better than to see new talent emerge in the comic book field, particularly people who brought something new to the game. He was not that impressed by people who showed him imitation Jack Kirby artwork, and he saw a lot of it in his life. He was impressed by someone who came in with a new art style, a new approach, something that had not been seen in comics before, but who was able to capture the same dynamism that he looked for in his work, the same humanity where humanity was appropriate, the same excitement where excitement was appropriate. And he saw Alex's early work and loved it. I wish he could have seen what you've done in the last few years. Did I just say something wrong, Alex?
Well, is that, I wasn't sure if your memory was accurate. We've talked about this before. He did actually see my work?
Yes, he saw your work. He saw a replica you did of the cover of Fantastic Four #1. What year did you do that in?
I thought I did it after he died.
Well, he saw something of yours. I remember talking about it with him.
Okay.
All right. Maybe...
Well, I know that he died in '94, and I can't remember. I thought I did that piece in '94 after I'd done all the Marvels issues, but my memory might be flawed here.
Well, I think it is, because I remember Jack at the previous San Diego convention, which would have been in July of '93. Seeing you, we were in the old convention center back then. It was maybe the last time we were in the old convention center, and I remember somebody had a print of that cover, and I remember someone showing it to him, and I was interested in his reaction to it. And now, having given you a compliment, I'm going to take a little bit away by saying Jack loved almost every artwork he saw. He was very encouraging to everybody. Right. And he liked creativity, and the only two things you could do with your artwork that would have gotten a negative reaction out of him is if it looked like you were just copying somebody else slavishly, or if you were lazy, if you hadn't put much effort into it. And those were the two things that got a negative out of Jack. And everything else he praised, including some stuff that I thought was pretty awful, frankly, but he was so giving to new talent. There was no one who didn't get his attention if they came up and said, "Mr. Kirby, I'd like you to look at my work." There were some people who I think exploited that a lot, but he was very supportive of new people in a way that not everybody in the industry was, because, you know, some of these guys felt like, you know, dinosaurs when the next species was arriving. They felt they were supposed to be shoved aside for the new kids coming in. And he talked in a very unusual way, where his mind was always racing. I tell people, you know, the average mind goes from A to B to C to D. Jack would start with A, then do R, then do W, then go back and pick up J, and at some point he'd have you on beyond zebra in the Dr. Seuss book, for all new letters. He jumped around a lot, and I think a lot of people didn't always understand him. And in my experience, there were times when Jack said things to me, and I would go, "Yeah, Jack, that's great," and I had no idea what he was talking about. And then a week later, a month later, even a decade later, I'd suddenly go, "Oh, I get it now." He was taking part of this conversation and part of that conversation and jumping from place to place. And I have this overview of Jack's work that a lot of his creativity was a case of putting two things together which no one else would thought of combining. He would take this visual image and this visual image and merge them, and it didn't resemble either, but there was an association there that he could see. The same way a lot of authors will read a mystery novel and a Western novel, and then they'll write a romance novel. They'll suddenly take a few words and concepts from this one and a few concepts from that, and all of a sudden they have something that's really a brand new creation, even though the foundation of it was based on something pre-existing. So anyway, now Alex, you have to answer the question for me. What was the first Kirby work that you were very conscious of that excited you?
I would always say, and I said it in John's book that he made a few years ago, where we all recounted our first interactions with Jack's work, the Sandman series that DC made in the early 70s, I adored. And when I first saw it, it wasn't even his work. It was Ernie Chan's work.
Yeah.
When he was filling in for Jack. So I loved the character design. And then I got the issue that Jack, well, actually he drew most of the issues, obviously, but I got an issue that Jack actually drew. And it was at that perfect kind of 70s stage of his work being an abstraction of the human form of life in a way that was becoming much more of a kind of pop art artifact. And I adored it. It connected with me as a young kid. I'm sure I imitated it in a number of cases, but I particularly loved his design and just graphic sense. I was a Kirby fan from the first time I encountered it.
That's interesting because Jack hated drawing that comic.
I know.
And yet enough Kirby came through anyway to excite you. I mean, that's amazing.
It's a beautiful character design. I mean, that's a gorgeous costume. And as an adult, I tried to link back this thing I loved from 75, I think, when it came out, when I was 5 years old. I was trying to link that with the history of the Sandman historical DC character by putting that same costume into Kingdom Come and saying, oh, by the way, the Sandman of the future is Kirby's Sandman. So I was trying to always sort of draw it back in. I wanted to be part of the DC mainstream in some way that it never got to be.
Is that your favorite all-time Kirby work, or are there other things you saw later that impressed you more?
Well, of course, there's so much more that he did that he cared about with so much more dedication and passion. I'm more connected in some ways to the work he did with the FF because I see the character of Reed Richards as an avatar for Jack much more than, say, Ben Grimm is, because it's sort of the soul of his creativity given form in a character who was both balancing the life of a husband, a father, and the leader of this group where everything that happens in the Fantastic Four is because of that character's drive, creativity, all the inventions he would make. He's the reason that all that moves forward. And I saw that as Jack himself channeling that into a lead character. That the FF is Reed's book more than anything else. But yeah, there's a million different books that I've and characters I've fallen in love with from Jack's hand.
John, you said, I believe, that Commandy was the book that got you excited about Kirby.
Well, yeah, much like Alex with Sandman, I don't think that's Jack's finest work by any means, but that's the one that initially hooked me, and that I first started following. I remember the Sandman series as well that Alex is talking about. At the time, I agree that that costume, it's like, you haven't really seen one like that anywhere else in comics, certainly not DC. And you could tell Jack wasn't quite as invested in that. I mean, probably because I think Michael Fleischer was writing some or most of those later. And you made a comment the other day on a panel we were doing, Mark, that mine and a couple other people, our first exposure to Jack that we really got hooked on were series that Jack not only drew but also wrote. And I think that's interesting that, Commandy, you could see Jack was involved in that more so than Sandman, for instance, in that particularly the first, 15, 20 issues. he was really trying to, despite past differences with DC, he was really trying to put his heart and soul into that book early on, as much as DC would let him. And I think maybe Sandman, not so much. You can kind of tell it was more like it was a job, and he did a very fine job on it for what he had to work with. But yeah, Commandy for me was just seeing the kind of unbridled imagination he was putting in, especially those first few issues, just took comics for me to a different level. And at that point, I knew I just had to figure out who this Jack Kirby guy is and what else he's done. And boy, wow, did I have no idea what I was getting into.
Sandman was an interesting turning point in Jack's life. It was the book that convinced him to go back to Marvel when he did it at DC. He had done this one shot with Joe Simon. Joe Simon had proposed to DC a new book version of Sandman, and Joe had written it, and Jerry Grandinetti had started drawing it. And Carmine was not happy with the early pages. So I'm not sure if Grandinetti drew the whole first issue or just the first part of it, but he drew some pages. And in the meantime, Bill Gaines of EC Comics fame had become an advisor to DC. Publisher of Mad, which is also owned by the same corporation, was helping DC out because the people upstairs at the corporation weren't that happy with the direction of DC Comics. And indeed, it was not that long after that Mr. Infantino was relieved of duty there. And Gaines harkened back to, of course, to the late 40s and 50s. And he kept saying to Carmine, you've got Joe Simon doing books for you. You've got Jack Kirby doing books for you. Why don't you put the two of them together? And Jack turned down that. He initially, it's nothing against Joe. He just wanted to do his own comics. He wanted to write and draw his own books without interference. And finally, Carmine beseeched him to do this one shot, to take Simon's script, revise it as necessary, which Jack thought it needed some revising. And they did this one shot issue that was not intended to go anyplace else, as just be a one shot and put it out. It did enormously well. Some would say due to speculators, but whatever it was, it suddenly prompted a new Sandman series on the schedule, and Carmine gave it to Joe Orlando to edit, who then in turn hired his favorite writer, Michael Fleischer, to draw it, and they tried to get Kirby to draw it. He hired Fleischer to write it, and he tried to get Jack to draw it, and Jack read the first script and said, I'm not having anything to do with this. I can't stand this. Jack resented the fact they hadn't just given him the book, because he had edited the one shot and rewritten it and drawn it. So why were they changing creative forces at that point? And so he agreed to do the covers of it. And then they hired Ernie Chan to ghost pencil, the pencil in Kirby's style, and Mike Royer, who of course, we all know Mike Royer's abilities, to ink it. And Jack did covers, and they put the name of Jack Kirby large on the cover, even though Jack did not do the insides. And he said to them, well, how about taking it off the book I'm not drawing and putting it on Commandy, which I am drawing? And they wouldn't do that. Instead, they finally forced Jack to draw Fleischer's scripts, some sort of inner politic thing which Jack resented. And he didn't like drawing the scripts. He didn't like being turned into, an artist only. He didn't see there was any future in it for him, and he didn't think the comic was going to do well, and he figured they'd blame him, which they did. So that's what kind of drove him back to Marvel, one of the things. And I happen to think that the artwork in that book, as good as it was, I think during that period, Jack did his worst work when he wasn't also the editor and writer of the comic. I have this theory, and we're going to talk about a lot of this stuff here in the time we have here, that people who don't like Jack's dialogue, and we've all encountered those people, would say, well, I wish Stan Lee or someone else had dialogued the New Gods books. And my belief is, and I remember I was on the premises watching as those books were created, that if somebody else had been doing the dialogue or had anything to do with the writing, those would not have been at remotely the same comics. They would not have been the same issues with different dialogue of the balloons. They would have been completely different comics about different things with different themes and probably not as good artwork. There are certain traits of artists that the industry always denies. They want everybody to work the same way too often. You write it, you pencil it, this guy will letter it, this guy will ink it, and that's not always the way to best deploy your people. It's like, Alex, if I came to you and told you, okay, you're doing this painting and I demand you do a complete pencil drawing of it completely and then let me approve it. And then weeks later, I'll give it back to you with my notes and you will adjust it the way I want it to. And then we're going to give it to someone else to do the color correcting and design. We're inhibiting your skills. You are the best judge of how to deploy you best and how to apply your talents best. And there's some guys who are wonderful artists who couldn't fit into that assembly line, only doing this little piece of the work. And Jack was one of them. You got your best work out of Jack is if you just let him do what he wanted. And it might not be the best work he ever did in his career, but it was the best work he would do at that period. You know, Fantastic. So people will say, well, I thought Fantastic Four was better drawn than New Gods. Yeah, Fantastic Four was drawn a couple years before New Gods. And Jack's eyes were failing him all throughout the 70s. And there were other problems, you know, inhibiting his artwork. You got the best work out of that Jack was capable of at that point if you let him do it himself. And,
what age was Jack in this time period? Can you tell me?
well, he was born in, what, 1917? I should know this. I'm his biographer.
Yeah, so in 1977, he would have been 60, right?
No, he would have been. Oh,
Yeah,
I didn't know there'd be any math in this quiz.
Well, can you tell me what would he have been in 1970? I mean, that's the
Well, if he
big
was born
question
in
I
if
have.
he was born in 1917, he would have been then he would have been in 1970. He would have been 53.
Okay.
Am I right? Yeah, 53. Which seemed like old at the time, and now it seems like young to me somehow. But age is a measure of years, not health. And Jack was having a lot of problems with his eyes during this period. A lot of what he did at DC, a lot of the career decisions he made vis-a-vis leaving Marvel, going to DC, the kind of deals he made, were trying to deal with the possibility that he might be unable to draw in the near future. And he was very terrified of that because although he was a highly paid artist, somehow the Kirby bank account was not overflowing with money. There were a lot of expenses, a lot of family expenses. He had medical expenses. He didn't have health insurance in his entire life until he got into the animation business in the 80s. And there was that nightmare that a lot of people in his age, Depression era kids have, of not being able to provide for your family. When Jack slept at night, he frequently had nightmares of two categories. One of them was being back in World War II and dealing with Nazis who were trying to kill him. And the other was of being out of work in the 50s and not being able to provide for his family, because that was a driving force in Jack. If you don't understand the extent to which this man took seriously the need to be a breadwinner and to have a paycheck and to pay for groceries and braces and health needs and such, you don't understand Jack Kirby. That's what motivated him from the morning, the moment he woke up in the morning to the moment he went at night. And even during the night, he was thinking about that stuff. He took it very seriously. And when he resented not getting what he felt was his proper credit and payment for work, that was an anger at someone who was denying his family its income and denying the family the possibility of exploiting his work after he passed and making some money off it. He was very serious about that. And I'm talking way too much in this. We got Alex here. Let's talk to Alex. All right, Alex, when you started doing comics, what were you doing before that as a profession? Before you worked, did your first work in the comic book field, whether it was a cover or a pinup or a poster or whatever it was, what were you doing professionally?
Advertising. I was doing storyboards for a Chicago ad agency that I got into when I was 19. So I had a quick 2-year associate degree program at the art school that I followed my mother at 40 years after her, but I completed the same exact education that she had and was able to get work here in Chicago. And while I had just started there, I was able to get my first commercial art jobs in comics within that first year, and pretty much always had my eye on the door to get from the one to the other to full-time employment in comics, which is never 100% guaranteed. But when I quit that job to go to comics full time, it was with the idea that, oh, I'm never going to be out of work. And it only dawns on me now, 30 years later, just how foolish that attitude was, because the bottom can drop out of you at any time. And I always thought, oh, well, I'll just pitch this project and that project. And fortunately for me, it worked out that way, but it doesn't always.
Mm-hmm. Now, what was the first thing you did of a comic book nature?
I worked on a comic for Now Comics called Terminator: The Burning Earth. So it was a Terminator movies franchise, and it was supposed to be the end of the license for them back in 1989. They had this thing that they were basically offering around to different pencilers, and a guy I worked with named Jim Wisniewski, he had been offered this since he had done some fill-in issues of the real Ghostbusters, and he said, hey, they offered me this, but you want to draw comics? And he introduced me to them. I did samples, got the gig, and then by the end of 1989, I was working on my first published work. And it was a 5-issue series that I did, a sort of hodgepodge of painted work, but mostly colored pencil on colored paper to look like it had a painted aesthetic to it.
And how much do you cringe now when someone asks you to sign a copy of that?
I can live with the after effect. I know it's not my, it immediately affected me with a sense of, I knew I was a better illustrator than what I had produced. So therefore the next jobs I do better prove that point. I knew I did better work in art school than I was able to muster in the time constraints of this 20 pages a month gig. And that was also when I had a 9-to-5 job. So I went back to my apartment every day to do another 6 hours of work before I would cash out at the end of the evening, and then to get up in the morning and go to a job downtown. So it was a exhaustive experience, and I credit it for why I'm bald today.
Okay, now, what artists in comics impressed you at the time, besides Jack?
Well, at the time, I was very affected by and it wasn't my first inspiration for painted comics, but the guy who was on the peak of that doing new work starting in '89 was Dave McKean with Black Orchid. And subsequently, I would see his Violent Cases series or graphic novel with Neil Gaiman, but he did that work. And then I think by the end of '89, they had the Arkham Asylum graphic novel came out, which was then the most successful, and for many years would prove to be the most successful, well-selling graphic novel that Grant Morrison wrote with him. And there was something to the realism in that work that I wanted to emulate, and a lot of the storytelling qualities that he did. He used a lot of live models. That's what I wanted to do too. And so in a weird way, Dave McKean has a hand in how I would evolve as an artist.
When you first did a drawing that was supposed to be a Kirby character or a Kirby influence, were you thrown by that? Were you felt challenged by it? What was I mean, you had not done that kind, but you had not done that kind of stuff in advertising.
No, but half the time I'm in advertising, I'm sitting in my office without a storyboard to do. So you spend a lot of your time doodling. And my entire proposal for what would become Marvels, I worked on in 1990 when I was 20 years old. So I basically worked with friends of mine who were other illustrators with me there. I used as models to base characters on to tell the story of the Human Torch and all the stuff that's very well documented from how my career began. But I was doing a lot of that kind of artwork there in-house, including character studies of things that Kirby had created, like Ben Grimm. And I got a photo of an old friend who looked like Ben Grimm to me, and it was a perfect thing of, I know a guy that is that guy. So I could build off of the reality I had, and I wanted to get across a likeness of Ben Grimm or the thing that would look like a little bit of Kirby was inside the character. So there was a lot there that I was excited to try and prove.
Was this like a guy with real bad psoriasis and doing the thing? Or how much help is a live model when you're drawing the Thing or the Human Torch?
Well, enormous. In the case of the very first pinup that I did of the Thing, for one thing, there's a little shot of Ben Grimm, the man, in there that is from this friend that I used the photo of, somebody I went to art school with. And then the actual body shot of the Thing, he's wearing his hat and the trench coat and everything. And that I did based upon, I think, the cover photo of Jack from the Comics Journal. And so I was studying his face, trying to get it in the eyes, trying to make sure that you saw a little bit of Jack inside that stony face. But when I worked with the character later in Marvel's, I just happened to have a friend who made a foam costume of really just a head and hands that he had sculpted of the Thing. And photography of that was absolutely essential for getting the kind of shadows and surface kind of qualities that come from life that your mind is going to have a harder time manufacturing from just imagination. You know, you need to see something to kind of begin to understand how it works.
Okay,
So, Alex,
John, you cut in here, John.
Yeah, I've got a question for you. So your early work, and this is kind of a two-part question. Your early work with that Terminator material you're talking about, was that you did traditional penciling and someone else inked it? Did you ink yourself? That was not painted work, correct?
It was painted work in the sense that some of the covers were full paintings, some of the pages were full paintings, but to speed the process along, I started working on black paper so that I was drawing graphite of the whole page and then going in with white paint to do the highlight of every area of form, and then embellishing the rest with colored pencil that would stand out on the black paper. So it would look a bit like a rendered painting, but it was kind of a quickie way of getting something that was darker as an illustration, that if it was just a painting going from white to darker tones would take a lot longer of a process to get to that final effect.
Okay, well, so the reason I'm asking, I'm curious because I know you've got a great appreciation of Kirby's work, and you did a painted version of a Kirby pencil drawing for the Jack Kirby Collector number 19. That was that great World War II piece that Steranko ran in his History of Comics. And I remember when that painting arrived here, and I was just blown away by it. But I was like, what does this guy see when he looks at Kirby's work? Does he see, soft tone pencil, and that's what he appreciates of Kirby? Does he see, Mike Royer's, very, very lush ink lines or brush lines, or Sennett's very slick work? What is it that speaks to you for Kirby's work? Is it his raw pencil work? Is it a particular inker that you really prefer best, and that's what you then translate into a painting? Because your work is obviously continuous tone paint, and you have to see things differently than we, dyed-in-the-wool comics fans that are used to seeing black lines on white paper with some coloring in between.
Well, certainly when I'm working with Jack's characters in mind, mostly just translating them into my own drawings, I'm going to soften up the forms enough to it's marrying up with reality more. But in the case of doing that one piece where I'm copying Jack's line work exactly, I've got to get that rigidity to come across. So I'm not wanting to rewrite the work. Like the oddity of that issue when you published it was, okay, there's my cover or the back cover of the book was my painting, and inside is a pull-out poster of Dave Stevens inking the exact same piece. And it was a weird contrast between two people who were both painters, myself and Dave, approaching a guy who we had this enormous admiration and dedication to, but both having an intellectual approach that was coming at different ways. It wasn't about color versus or tone versus ink line. It's about the way we saw to interpret the thing. And I think that Dave began to soften and curve and correct the forms that Jack had done. So his inking was masterful, obviously. Dave was a distinctive individual as an inker, like many who are really talented inkers. But he was correcting, whereas I took Jack sort of warts and all, because of course that was a pencil piece that I was recreating, not one that had been embellished by anybody yet. And Jack's natural pencil lines were rougher, and he would block things in with a quick shading of a dark form. And I was trying to translate that into kind of a tonal form that didn't soften him too much, that actually kept the hardness available in there. But the part that would be the Alex Ross part was saying, what is the lighting in the scene dictating? If the lighting is coming from explosions behind Bucky and Captain America, it's likely going to create cast shadows that are affecting everything. So therefore, I shot a live model for Cap, my friend who always poses for Captain America, and I set the light source from below, kind of creating these interesting cast shadows going up the face. And then I applied those shadows onto Jack's drawing, because of course I just photocopied the piece from Steranko's History of Comics, blew it up on a piece of paper, traced it all off exactly. I didn't work on authentic Kirby pencils, so I never ruined anything. But I was about as close to his hand as it felt like you could be. And then I'm giving this extra little shadow element that he didn't plan for, but it seemed to fit the roughness, because I kept all the other rough edges exactly as they were without losing a single one of them. I didn't want to soften him. I didn't want to correct the Nazi that's really clear on the cover. I didn't want to correct the way his cap was drawn or his Luger. I wanted to all be exact to the way Jack conceived those things, warts and all, because that's his soul coming through. I wanted to preserve him, and I'll have loads of other loads of other chances in my professional life, as I have, to go to his characters and then give them my own sort of physicality and limitations that will try and marry realism, realistic figure drawing with Jack's energy and sensibility. So there would always be more chances for me to put more of myself into it. But in that particular case, doing that piece for you was a chance to really try and bow down to his inherent aesthetic. That's a long answer.
You naturally gravitate more toward like Royer's inking in your preference for Kirby because he's more faithful to Kirby's pencil line, or more to Sinnott, who tends to stylize more, because obviously you stylize that piece even though you were very faithful to the core piece?
Actually, I've always had a real soft spot for Dick Ayers, because when Dick worked with him in '59 through, I don't know, whatever year in the '60s, he kind of found this realism middle ground that I think was in those early Monster stories and then those early FF stories that just, I can look at that stuff and see what seems to me like as strong a figure drawing representation of a human being as possible. In fact, I think that Kirby's exaggerations of form, the wide stances, the figure forms and hands coming out more towards the viewer would almost be, it was a creative embellishment over time, but as the '60s would wear on and greater artists would enter the field than had existed before, people like Buscema and Adams and Romita, they would bring in their particular skills. And Jack was in his own way, I think, competing with them by pushing the extremes of what he could exaggerate to. But before they arrived, I think he was almost reaching a certain apex of his own figure drawing ability of just drawing the natural world as it was. And Ayers aided in that execution.
I was always impressed, Alex, that when you brought a new area of lighting and form to Jack's work, when you were interpreting something like that drawing, or that piece from the Glory Boat you did that was in my book on Jack, you kept all the expression and emotion in the faces and the people, which is, I had never really seen anybody paint Captain America in a fully rendered thing without turning him into a statue. Usually people would drain the emotion out of the characters by using photo references and such. And of course, photo reference is not going to give you the 110% expressions in the face of a Kirby character. And you kept all that, which is John, there was one year when Alex painted the official poster for the Academy Awards. And he did this beautiful painting of an Oscar, and I went to cover it. I was offered a press pass, and I went to this thing at the Hollywood and Highland thing where they unveiled the poster. And I don't know if you remember this, Alex, because you were being besieged with people there. And I went up to you and said, wow, what a waste. You're painting a character with no face. I meant that as a compliment, but you were painting, it was like the dullest drawing ever of the Silver Surfer to me. It was the Oscar. It was not a human being. And Alex does human beings so well that,
Well, I could lose myself in the chrome rendering. That's where I got excited.
Yeah. By the way, I feel sorry for the Oscars now, because this is a very bad era to be a statue. Someone will come and tear you down immediately. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about, Alex mentioned we should talk a little about
Shazam.
Well, I was going to say misconceptions about Jack. We can talk about
sure.
Shazam if you want to, but misconceptions about Jack. Do you want to go first, Alex?
Well, I had this observation based upon a conversation you and I had, which is you've got this repeated thing where people think Jack was a terrible writer once left to his own devices. And you've got certain people out there who worked in the business at that time in the 70s where he created that most famous body of work that he was writing, The New Gods, and then subsequently the stuff he would go on to do for Marvel again, like the Eternals. And that clearly he wasn't a guy who should have been holding all the pieces together himself. He needed help. That was the theory. And that is the public perception of Jack. And whereas there's something to say that when you read the naked work and you could have a reaction that can be very critical of what you see there, whether it seems like, dialect or slang or witticisms that seem very removed from where the culture was, or that he wasn't quite getting where people were. What I wish people understand is that he wasn't being the exact writer he was always born and built to be, that he was this extremely talented person who had very strong work he was capable of doing as a writer that was blunted by the period of time he worked with Stan Lee. And my point to this is aided by the issue of the Kirby Collector, where John published this whole spotlight on Tiger 21. And in that, John didn't translate the work that was written by Jack for this comic strip that he tried out in the 50s. Is that right, John? It was like 56, 7, something like that?
Right, yeah.
And you put the artwork in there where if you look closely enough at it, as I did, to see all the text, you could read the full story as Jack had written this science fiction adventure out. And what blew my mind with it is it was extremely well written. It was compelling. It was smart. There was no smart aleck kind of witticisms to it because he didn't think that way. That's not who he was. He wasn't a smart alecky guy. So I expressed this observation to Mark and to my friend Kurt Busick, where we had Kurt kind of brought me up to the sense of like, yeah, that's what Stan kind of ruined, that part of Jack that was this really solid writer who could have done more. But since he spent that 10 years with Stan, with his elaboration on top of Jack's plots, the dialogue that Stan wrote that was extremely effective, very excellent of its time, made Jack think, by other people's comments to him, that this is what they want. They want this sort of attitude, they want this wit, they want this sort of angle on things. And that's not who Jack was, but he ultimately tried to build a hybrid version himself and Stan Lee, thinking, well, I can do that. Like, he never really got the Stan Lee method, as well as that marriage worked for that period of time. It wasn't something that really, it was never part of Jack, that approach, what Stan brought to things. And I think the 70s work is affected by trying to present something to people that was more what they expected of that, what they were telling him for years. You got to imagine that as soon as Jack started seeing the general public, not just the young men that showed up at his home like Steve and Mark did, but for all the conventions he went to, there was probably people telling him every 5 minutes, oh, I love you and Stan working together. Why can't you do that again? I love Stan's dialogue on your scripts. And I think it drove him kooky.
Well, I think there's something to that. Yeah, I think one of the problems Jack had was that he discovered, and at both DC and Marvel, there was no way to get paid for any part of the writing or any credit unless you did the whole dialogue. There was no such thing as payment
Right.
for making up the story and figuring out what should go on in each panel. And in fact, when he went to DC, a number of DC writers, young writers, went to Carmine and said, "Oh, let me be Jack's let me be Jack's writer." And they meant let him make everything up. Let him figure out what goes on in every panel. I'll go in and put in the copy, and I will take the writer credit and money. And one or two of them went to Jack directly. Carmine said, "Jack's the editor. You talk that up with him," because Carmine wasn't going to say no to these guys. Make Jack the bad guy who did that. And they went to Jack and said, "I want to be the writer. Send me the first issue, and I'll write it." And that offended the hell out of him, because one of the things that happened when Jack went to DC was he suddenly got credit for anything he contributed to the plot, finally, and he got writer money. His income went way up because he was now getting paid for as a writer and recognized as a writer. And also, he had reached the point where he wanted his comics to come out the way he wanted them. His problem with Stan Lee's dialogue wasn't so much the style of it, it's just that he'd look at the finished book sometime and go, "That's not what was going on in that panel. That's not what that panel was supposed to say." And frequently Stan would consciously change the whole thrust of a story, particularly in the late 60s when Jack was feeling very public conscious of the Vietnam War and the changes that were going on in the United States. It was a politically turbulent time then. Thank God it's not like that today. And he wanted to inject his stories with themes about the real world, to do the kind of thing to some extent which later Denny O'Neil would take to the next level, and we called it relevance. And Stan was draining all that out. Now, you can argue whether that was good or bad, and that's not an argument where any of us are equipped to have without, being able to see more of Jack's pencils and liner notes and things. But what Stan did kept seeming wrong to him. It was the same way that certain inkers, you look at the penciler looks at what the inker does and goes, "He didn't understand what I was drawing there. That's not what I drew. That's not what the character was supposed to do. That's not the expression he was supposed to have. This guy interpreted it wrongly." That it may have been better for the audience is a separate matter. And
of course, the difference is too that Stan wasn't his collaborator; he was his boss.
Yeah.
So whatever Stan decides goes.
Yeah, including Stan often would want pages redrawn because he wanted to change the story. Jack would plot the whole story out based on one sentence, not that Stan had given him, but that they'd agreed upon. As Stan used to say, "I'll just tell Jack, make the next issue have Dr. Doom, or sometimes he'll tell me." That was a plot frequently on those books. And Jack would draw 20 pages out and send it in, and Stan would look at it and go, "I need these 4 pages redrawn. I want to have other things happen on the story." And so Jack would do these redraws for which he was not paid. He lost a couple of days' income by not being able to do work for which he'd be paid, and he felt he was harming his story tremendously. He did not agree with the changes, as sometimes happens. But the thing that was a problem for Jack in writing the comics at the time was he was getting all sorts of mixed signals from DC and then later at Marvel. I have been debating for years, since the 70s, with people who came to me and they said, "Jack needed an editor." And I say, "Okay, who should that have been?" "Oh, somebody." Well, at DC, the editor, if they'd given one of the books if they'd assigned someone else to be the editor of New Gods, and that person edited it the way they edited their other comics, it would be the equivalent of when Saul Harrison, who was the head of the production department, sat me down with Steve Sherman and said, "You got to get Jack to draw more like Kurt Swan. That's what a comic should look like." So you'd be having some editor saying to Jack, "You got to write more like Leo Dorfman. You got to write more like Bob Kanigher," which wasn't Jack Kirby. What's the point of even having Jack Kirby if he's not going to be Jack Kirby? And he had, I don't think there was an editor in the business he could have worked with at DC. And then the other people would say, well, he should have had a different dialogue writer. And then I would say, okay, who should that person be? And usually the person who was telling me that would think it should have been him.
Yeah.
And I don't think that would have worked. It's
Well, there's a perfect example of where that actually took place. If you look at the last, 6, 7 issues of Commandy, let's see, numbers 30, was it 33 through 36, I think, Jerry Conway took over as editor while Jack still continued to direct the stories and draw them and dialogue them. But Conway kind of interjected a little bit. And then like the last 3, 4 issues, 37 through 40, Conway was editor and writing those, and all Jack did was draw working from the script. And if you compare those to any of the other issues of Commandy, you know, you can see the heart and soul is not there. The verve that Kirby put in his work is not there. And it's the same true of all that other kind of forgotten Kirby work from that era. That one fill-in issue of Richard Dragon Kung Fu Fighter, or the Justice Incorporated issues that Denny O'Neil wrote. You know, on the surface, it seems like that's a great choice for Jack to do as a series. But I mean, all he's doing is the art there. He had very limited actual creative input into it. And it just, you know, what a waste of the man's talents, first of all.
Well, the analogy I sometimes use, in the music field, there was this man named Irving Berlin, who was, some people thought was the greatest American songwriter of the century. And Irving Berlin always wrote the words and the music. And people went to him occasionally and said, can I collaborate with you? Can I write the lyrics, you write the music, or vice versa? And he said, no, I only do them as a set. I cannot collaborate. I just can't work that way. And I think that Jack had become that kind of person. I think to some extent he always was, but he was able to temper the other side of him, because when he was working with Joe Simon, there were enormous advantages to working with Joe Simon. Joe Simon was a very strong force as a co-editor. He was a guy that Jack learned from. They were both young. They were making mistakes together, and they were buddies. And Joe was a good negotiator who protected Jack and got them real good deals. So Jack didn't feel he had to have control of the work then. Then when he's at Marvel, Stan was going to write the dialogue, or Stan was going to take the writer credit. Regardless, Stan was the guy in charge. You worked for Marvel or that way, or you didn't work for Marvel, as Wally Wood found out. And then when Jack had the opportunity to do his own work, he grabbed it. And he didn't want to go back because, for one thing, he didn't see a collaborator anywhere that he felt compatible with. And he didn't see that doing artwork where somebody else is writing it would advance his career any. Jack had made his greatest leaps in stature and income by creating new comics. This is why when he went back to DC, he didn't want to do the Challengers of the Unknown again. He'd done the Challengers of the Unknown. He wanted to create something new that would revolutionize the business or sell phenomenally well. And he could get raises, and he could get more control, and he could get anything that you'd want as an artist and writer by creating something brand new that would sell. You didn't really enhance your career by, drawing existing books that much. And he needed that control. I found when I was editing comics that I had to recognize that the sensibility of the artist mattered. You couldn't just hand a guy a script or an assignment and say, just do this and hand it back. I was always fascinated why some artists did great work on this comic and poor work on another comic. And the reason was frequently the atmosphere, the directives, the kind of editorial direction they were shoved in. I worked for I'll name 2 artists I worked with a lot who were like this, Doug Wildey and Dan Spiegel. These were 2 guys who could not work the way they expected, like Kurt Swan or John Buscema to work, of penciling the thing and then letting somebody else ink it. They just couldn't do it. That's not how they worked. They didn't do their best work that way. They did their best work when they could just draw the comic themselves and have it lettered later, or have it letter it themselves rather than send it off to New York and ink it later. Doug Wildey did his best artwork that way, and you wanted his best artwork. You wanted Dan Spiegel's best artwork. And whenever these guys started working for DC or Marvel, someone would say, okay, you just pencil it and we'll have, Frank Giacoia ink it, or we'll have Vince Colletta ink it, or we'll have, Murphy Anderson ink it. And they were not guys who were suited for their skills that way. And Jack had become kind of a one-man band. He had to kind of edit it himself. He had to kind of write it himself. He had to kind of pencil himself. And if he had had more time or the business allowed it, he would have probably have wanted to color it himself, because he was never that thrilled with the coloring he got, except in the early 60s at Marvel. As long as it was Stan Goldberg and Maurice Evanier, he was happy with the coloring. He wasn't happy with any of the coloring he got at DC, and most of the coloring he got at Marvel after that. So, you know.
And I would like Alex to comment on Jack's coloring before we're through here, and how how he views coloring and how he sees Jack's work. If not now, then later in the discussion, because Jack's sense of color, how he applied it to his work, was just like no one else. You know, it was just like his art style. It was totally idiosyncratic. You know, no one else would apply color the way Jack did. But Alex, in some of your paintings, though, that you've done that are Kirby inspired, I see some of that coming through. I assume that's conscious, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And having worked with a bunch of the characters he created in portfolios where there's only like one image to go by, he would choose a rainbow of colors to throw into a given character design, but they would often be almost counterintuitive to, I think, anybody else's senses. You know, he would sometimes have the sort of mirror reflective image or the chrome-like effect on a character be two different tones of completely contrasting colors, like, you know, reds right next to greens, as if it existed in this reflective surface. And he would choose a lot of kind of earth tone colors mixed with your bright colors. And I enjoyed recreating some of these things in paintings, working with the characters from his prototype New Gods portfolio, or what do you call the one that was the Sigurd and the other Norse gods?
The four gods plates.
That was kind of like Asgard alt.
Yeah, I mean, there's such interesting choices there, and I love the nature of the way Jack's instincts would take him, and also for the paintings he would do in the 70s and early 80s. You know, the things where he gave himself over to just his initial burst of creativity. In fact, I'm wearing one of them right now.
There you go.
You know, I love this piece, by the way. But, you know, it would just be a smattering of different color choices, not to necessarily prove that he had the strongest color sense, but that he had an innovative color sense.
Yeah. There was a lot of instinct in what Jack did. He worked very fast, as everyone knows. And, you know, if I said to Jack, so why'd you do that? He goes, oh, and he'd make up a reason then. He was not conscious of it at the time, for the most part. He was very, it was kind of, you know, I find a lot of comparisons to what Jack did with what I learned when I started studying improv comedy. The idea of not thinking about it and saying it, but just sitting down and saying it, doing it, as opposed to writing it in your head completely first and then replicating that on the paper. He was very spontaneous, and he was right way more often than I think he had a right to be with these things. I'm still, you know, I'm still kind of agog at what came out of that man and his abilities, and how fast I saw some of that stuff materialize, and without a lot of studying. I mean, he was a deep thinker. He thought very deep about issues, but the stories were kind of created by a seat of the pants speed, and the energy translated to the page. A lot of people think that the best artwork Jack ever did at Marvel in the 60s was that Captain America 112, which he kind of knocked out over a weekend. 20 pages of Captain America with Captain America dead in them. It was quite a challenge. Yeah. We need a 20-page Captain America story. And by the way, Captain America is dead throughout the story. And,
you know, I have a question for you based upon, you mentioned Captain America, and you mentioned before about his wanting to respond to the times he lived in. When he first worked on Tales of Suspense with the stories for Cap, right after he did, I think maybe it was before the revisitation to World War II stories with Bucky, but when he first got on that book, didn't he automatically take Captain America right away into Vietnam?
Pretty close, yeah. I think there were lots of discussions whether Captain America should be set in the present day or in the past. And at one point, I actually, during the time Jack was working for Marvel in the late 70s, I was talking to Mark Grunwald back then, I think it was, and he was saying, we're having a problem with Jack's stuff doesn't tie in with the present day Marvel universe. Is there any way we can get him to tie his stuff in with all the other books? And I said, no. And I said, listen, let me give you an idea. Throw this around the office. Why don't you guys have Jack do a Captain America book set in the 40s? Because he'd love it. He loved that era. He certainly has enough World War II stories to fill the book forever, and his dialogue wouldn't bother you as much if it was set in story set in 1941. It would, that might be a solution, and nobody liked that idea because they really wanted Jack, drawing stuff that they could dialogue. But
even in the time where he was not supposed to go into a certain subject matter, he actually wanted to approach the crux of our times, the new war we were entering in the 1960s. And he directed to go right there immediately with the character that would seem the most appropriate to do it. And if I remember correctly, he has Captain America go right into the deal with the Viet Cong, and then right in with their lead henchman and take him down in a fight. And he sort of wrote off Captain America solving Vietnam all in one issue.
Yeah, well, he also did that in Thor. There was also a Thor sequence set in Vietnam. But there were arguments at Marvel about that. It's funny. Stan Lee was kind of in the middle. There's a line I may have said it, or someone else may have said it, and I quoted it. That at one point Stan's problem was he was too conservative to work with Kirby and too liberal to work with Ditko. And Stan himself was kind of all over according to other people, Stan was kind of all over the map politically, trying to decide where he came down in the Vietnam War thing, and what he felt, who he felt should be president and such, that he was, like it was like a tug of war going on with him at some point. Stan and Jack had a lot of fights on the early Sergeant Furies based on the fact that they had very different views of how World War II should be depicted. Jack was very passionate about certain elements of it. Jack had seen combat. Stan was doing VD pamphlets during that time and such, and not to knock it or anything, he just wasn't as emotionally invested in that war as Jack was. I don't think anybody was. So Jack got off the Sergeant Fury book largely because the two of them were fighting too much about the way to depict the Jewish character and the way to depict war at that time. Mm-hmm. These comics are a product of their time, and they're a product of what the individual writers and artists were going through at that moment frequently. And some of it dates very well, and some of it doesn't. I am delighted with how well some of Jack's stuff stands up today, whereas a lot of comics that were thought of as very relevant to their time in the 70s, no one's buying, no one's reprinting. There's no real call for them. There's something very timeless about what Jack did, and which it pleases me greatly. You can see behind me shelves, and you can see the little, or is it that way? The blue book, there's the Kirby Omnibus over there. I just love that this stuff is now in hardcovers. It's being bought by a new audience. I kind of like, in a perverse way, the fact that it's expensive and people are still shelling out money for it. It's just wonderful work that stands out. And we are running out of time, believe it or not, gentlemen. We've barely scratched the surface here.
But we're not going to talk about the Shazam story you revealed to me?
Well, okay. If you want to, we'll go a little over and see if the convention doesn't object, okay?
Okay, I'll just set it up really fast that I had approached you about whether or not the character of Captain Marvel, the original one, had been something that Jack had an involvement with Marvel. And then you said, well, not quite the way you would think. And then you brought up about how he is responsible for bringing Shazam back in the context of the DC book that would happen by pitching it to Carmine, where you were there in person to witness the pitch.
Yes. This is something which other people deny, but I stand by my story.
Who denies it?
People who want to other people want to take credit for it. The idea of bringing Shazam back in the 70s. Jack loved Captain Marvel, original Captain Marvel, and not just because he did an issue of it, but he just thought that was one of the greatest comics ever done. If there was any comic book that he admired that was not Simon and Kirby in the 40s, it was Captain Marvel. And you see traces of it all over the place in his work. The strip that never got published, The Silver Spider, which morphed into the Fly, and Archie, which morphed into Spider-Man, was a kid with a magic ring who turns into a big giant superhero. Thor has obvious overtones of Captain Marvel in it. Jack did a number of stories over the years of that. When Jack was doing New Gods for People, Mr. Miracle for DC, he wanted to edit comics that he would not write or draw. DC said, oh yeah, we're open to that, but they really weren't. They wanted the books controlled editorially in New York, and they just wanted Jack to do, the page quota he had, which was roughly 15 pages a week of his own work, and hand it in, and the comics by other people could be edited by other people. But before Jack gave up on that, he was trying to think of a comic that he could add to the DC lineup, that he could supervise, and he could supervise the writing of it, and somebody else could write it, possibly me or Steve Sherman. Somebody else could draw it, in this case, C.C. Beck. He said, why don't you bring back Captain Marvel? You're the only company that can do it, because the way Fawcett had settled the lawsuit, Fawcett agreed not to ever publish Captain Marvel again without DC's permission. So DC was the only company around that could publish Captain Marvel. So he told this, we were at a convention at downtown LA. Mr. Infantino was out there, and he sat in a room. Steve Sherman was with me, Carmine's then lady friend, and Jack and Roz. And he told this idea, let's bring back Captain Marvel. And Carmine was open to it. I contacted C.C. Beck. I had a friend named Gary Brown, who is probably going to watch this video at some point, who will remember me, writing to him, says, can you give me C.C. Beck's phone number? And he got it for me. And I called C.C. Beck, and he was interested in drawing it again. And we presented this as a package to DC. And Carmine said, this is a great idea, we'll do it. And then a week later, he says, we really kind of have to have it edited by the people back here. And they took the project away from Jack. And it was not the success they were hoping for. I don't know. I'm not saying that it would have been with Jack in control of it, but that's how it started. And Jack was never credited for that. Nobody ever said that was his idea. Mr. Beck was upset because he thought he was going to be working with Jack as his editor, and he did not get along with Julius Schwartz. Mr. Schwartz was a lovely man who, did some great comic books, but he wasn't a fan of Captain Marvel. There was this idea that DC had at that point, well, since Captain Marvel's like Superman, we should have it done by the same office that does Superman. So let's get Denny O'Neil to write it. And they were originally going to have Bob Oxner draw it, and they were originally going to have Julius Schwartz edit it, which I think he actually did. And Jack's point was, no, the idea is that Captain Marvel is not like Superman. It should be done by different people, have a different feel and a different flair. And fortunately, there was this wonderful gent who worked for DC named Nelson Bridwell, who I think is an unsung hero of 70s comics, who understood Captain Marvel and persuaded DC to get Beck. I gave Nelson Beck's phone number, and Nelson wrote some of the better stories that were done of that character in that series, but was hampered by the fact that Julius Schwartz was not an editor who appreciated the old stories, and therefore wasn't interested in doing the old type of stories. And so anyway, that's basically the story of that. And I don't think Shazam has been successful for DC ever. They've been some merchandising deals that are very nice that make it worth the purchase, but has there ever been a Shazam comic in print that was a huge seller? I don't know. I don't recall anybody.
I don't think it was a failure back then when it was launched. It had what was the initial fan reaction of everybody over ordering this thing and getting it. There was a lot of copies made of that first issue, I believe, right?
Yes.
So yeah. There was expectation, and there was, certainly the support for it that led all the way to a television show, a couple television shows. And, I grew up in an era where you saw that character on the same footing with he was on the top level with DC's brand, Wonder Woman, Batman, Robin, and Superman. And he was always that major character with them before the rest of anybody else you could name. So I always absorbed him as a major part of comics history from just the DC angle.
Yeah. Well, anyway, that's how it started. And Jack didn't get credit for a lot of things that he thought of and he suggested. There's a lot of stories that are not really verifiable, but where Jack made suggestions to other writers and to other artists and things like that. There was a writer named Robert Bernstein who wrote tons of comics for DC, Marvel, Archie, one of the most prolific guys from the mid 50s through into the 60s. He wrote for EC, the comic Psychoanalysis, which EC produced. He wrote, and one of the characters in it was based on his own personal psychoanalysis. And Bernstein lived near Jack and would frequently find him on the subway train in New York. And they'd sit together, and Bernstein would say, I got to give Mort Weisinger a plot in 20 minutes for a Superman story. And Jack would say, here's an idea. Now, people have taken that fact, which is pretty much verified, and extrapolated from that. Well, this Robert Bernstein story was a little like this Kirby story someplace. So obviously that came from Jack. That's conjecture and speculative. But Jack was this fount of ideas. Anybody who met him, if you walked in to Jack's office, to studio, and said, here's an idea I have for a new superhero, Jack would tell you more about your character than you'd all figured out about it. He would say, why don't you have him give him a sidekick like this? Why don't you give him a villain like this? How about if he drives a car like this? And you'd think, did I show this to Jack months ago and he's been thinking about it all this time and I forgot it? No, he came up with all that stuff on the spot, which is one of the things, seeing him do that over and over is when it's so credible to me when he would tell me that he invented this or that in some other comic.
And he also did tell you personally his reflection about having a concept for a Kree warrior gone rogue.
Yeah, which ended up being the basis of Marvel's Captain Marvel there. Now, I don't know how much...
he's responsible for both versions of Captain Marvel in the modern era.
He had a hand in them. I don't know. Again, I don't want to he had the idea of the Kree warrior going rogue. They were going to do it in Fantastic Four. It wound up being the basis of Marvel's Captain Marvel. Now,
but he was never asked to participate with that.
Well, he was asked. He turned down because at that point he said, if we're going to create a brand new book, I should get a better deal.
Oh, right, because he was trying to get the deal with Goodman, which never happened.
Yeah. So he basically said at some point near the end of Marvel, every time Stan said, Martin wants new characters, Jack said, yeah, I want a new deal.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the new deal before we talk about new characters.
And then his idea that he offered to Stan wound up showing up in that book in 1968.
Well, I don't know that he offered it to Stan for that Captain
Well, he described it.
An idea that he had for a sequence in Fantastic Four.
But for it to then show up as the basis for that first issue scripted by Stan.
Yeah, well, you don't know about these things. The thing you got to remember here is that Jack just threw out these ideas left and right all over the place. I mean, the volume of his creativity was staggering to me. And in 1970, Steve Sherman and I made a trip back to New York, and we went to the DC offices and the Marvel offices. And I'm afraid I'm telling a story. I'm starting to tell a story now I told in the other Kirby panel we did that's running in part of this Comic-Con series. But everybody I went up to, all these guys I met who had done the comics of my childhood, John Romita and Bill Everett and Don Heck and all these guys, when I said to them, I'm Jack Kirby's assistant, they threw their arms around me and told me how brilliant Jack was. Now, he gave them all these ideas. And I thought it kind of confirmed for me, yeah, Jack said he was giving everybody ideas for other books. And Don Heck just said that to me, that a lot of the Iron Man villains were Jack's idea, which I take to be a pretty good source. I got continually impressed by Jack over the years. And I got impressed also by his influence on people. Alex, you are one example of many, of hundreds I could name, of people who, without penciling Fantastic Four for a living and being inked by someone imitating Joe Sinnott, brought some Kirby influence to your work. Not exclusively, because you do a lot of things that have no trace of Jack in them, or very minor. They have the sense of that everybody you've seen has influenced you in some way. but there's certainly overt things you do where you go, wow, that's the Kirby energy. But he's not swiping Kirby hands. He's not swiping Kirby poses necessarily. He's got that excitement in the work. Steve Rude is another example of how Jack was really impressed with Steve Rude's work, because Steve was achieving a lot of the same things Jack strove to achieve in his work without swiping, copying, imitating him. There's a lot of guys that Jack loved. He loved most of the Image guys. He was really enthused by them. The guys who did the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, he was very enthused by them too. He welcomed all these new people into the industry. You will not find a single story of anybody who took their work to Jack and was said that he discouraged them from ever doing anything. He may have discouraged them from working for DC or Marvel because for practical reasons, but he encouraged people to be artists. He encouraged people to be writers. He encouraged people to be creative. And it's one of the reasons that I keep doing these silly panels where I'm telling people about Jack, because I think that's the message you have to carry along to people. And I'm going to wrap this panel up no matter what anybody says. John, thank you for joining us for this. Again, I know you're so tired of talking about Jack all the time. And
Strangely enough, never.
No, it doesn't get tired. And Alex, thank you. You and I have had some fascinating conversations on the phone, and it's nice to let the world in on some of what we say, because you are a good guy who carries on exactly what Jack was hoping other people in comics after him would carry on. So
well, thank you for indulging me. I was hoping to share some of this with the public.
Okay, thank you all. We will try to do a Jack Kirby panel next year, hopefully at the convention with actual human beings in attendance. And if one of these days, we will drag you out there, Alex, kicking and screaming to be part of it. Thank you very much, everybody.
I will be kicking and screaming.